Okay, well, it's about time that we begin. Thank you all for being here tonight for the second of a series of talks and events that we call the SBM Speaker Series. Previously, you heard from us about remote work and how that was changing. Tonight, the topic is something that's on everybody's mind, AI. And so I want to tell you a little bit about our speaker, Aditya Challapally. He's a machine learning engineer and product lead at Microsoft. He develops GenAI products for global markets, and he used to work at McKinsey Company and Uber, where he spearheaded other AI initiatives. He currently advises Silicon Valley startups and Fortune 500 companies on GenAI execution, and he wrote a book entitled Product Management Interview Handbook, which is part of the curriculum at Stanford University and other institutions. He lectures on product management and AI at Stanford, of course, and he has his degree from Western University in Canada, excuse me, with a bachelor's in engineering and a BA. So without further ado, we'd like to welcome and present to you Aditya Challapally, who's going to talk about Gen AI debunking common myths. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jordan. And team, I see that there's 15 of us here, and I'm sure more people will join, but I like to keep these sessions as interactive as possible. So if you have any questions at any point, let me know, and I'll be asking some questions throughout. Feel free to post the answers in the chat. But as Jordan mentioned a little bit about me, I guess he talked a lot about me, but what I'll say is a little bit about the course and what where this material is from. So I teach one major course at Stanford, which is called Mastering GenAI for Product Innovation, and I also help teach two other courses, one of which I wrote the product management book for, and what this webinar hopes to combine is some of the most critical pieces of information from all of those three courses. To get this information, we spoke to 50 plus executives from leading Fortune 500 and Silicon Valley startups and did a user research survey with more than 300 users. So everything I'm going to say to you is data backed and research backed. None of it's necessarily my opinion as much as it is what's in the research. So the first thing I'm going to show you is this curve. And, as I said, I want this session to be as interactive as possible. So if you have any guesses about what this curve is, please put those guesses in the chat. But I'll give you some hints as we go along. Number one, when this curve first started to happen, people called it a bubble, and people were undecided if it was a bubble or if it was actually going to create real value. And then people started saying, we have other priorities, but this curve is clearly going to be a big thing. And so we built in internal tools to sort of test it out. And then pretty rapidly right after that, companies got disrupted pretty majorly and new ones got created. And then the last hint I'm going to give you is we're here right now in the world of where Gen AI is. We're right here. We're right here. It's a bubble. People are unsure if it's a bubble or, people are sure it's going to create value, but most companies are still creating internal tools. Are there any guesses? I think you can post in the Q&A as to what this curve is. Jordan, you can feel free to guess as well. No guesses?
Adoption of AI.
No, it's actually this is the internet. So this curve is the internet. So this is around 1993, 1994, and even 1999, anywhere from 1993 to 1999, where people thought it was going to be a bubble and they didn't think there was going to be any existing value. Around 2002, 2003, companies started to build internal tools. But by the time 2004, 2005, 2006, 2007 came out, some companies were significantly disrupted and new ones were created. And what we found with the internet, and this curve, is the economic value produced by the internet. So when people thought it was a bubble in 1999, it's actually a fraction like less than 1/1000th of the value that's created today by the internet. And so we're here right now with generative AI where people are confused if it's going to be a bubble or it's going to create real value. A lot of these companies are making internal tools, not really putting anything out in front of users just yet. And the same thing is going to happen where a lot of these companies are going to get disrupted and new ones are going to get created. And we have significantly underestimated the value that is going to be created with both the internet and with generative AI. And there's some other strands that we can talk about with the early days of the internet. Number one, generative AI is a new platform. So nobody exactly knows what's going on and nobody knows who's going to win necessarily. We do know that the tech is improving very rapidly as it was in the early days of the internet. And users don't have solid preferences yet, which all means that the game is yours to capture. If you go out and start something new here, then you have as good of a chance as anybody else or even some incumbents, which we'll talk about in a second. Cool. And if you have any questions on that, feel free to post in the Q&A. But I want to talk about the tech for a little bit. So, excuse me. When I say generative AI, we're going to do a generative AI workshop, all these things. Just know that that's a very general marketing term. It's not really a technical term. Generative AI is actually composed of different types of models, like generative adversarial networks, which is actually where generative AI gets its name from. Transformers, variational autoencoders, a bunch of stuff. But basically, if you want to establish yourself as somebody who knows Gen AI well, you want to call yourself an ML expert, not necessarily a Gen AI expert. That's why you never hear of Gen AI engineers, because that doesn't really exist. ML engineers exist because engineers who understand the technical side understand that AI is sort of just a vision and a marketing term. ML is the actual technical term that people work on. So that's why people that generally call themselves ML researchers or ML engineers. So if you're walking into a room and you're a business person and you say, oh, I want to do something in generative AI, we sort of immediately know that you don't know what you're talking about. You should say something like, I want to do something in machine learning. Okay, so there's a few types of generative AI that we should talk about before we go about busting some myths. So there's three main types of generative AI. The first one is collaborative, which a type of generative AI or an application of generative AI that works with you. That means every idea is amplified and every possibility is explored. Like as you're writing a Word document, it writes with you, it critiques you, all these things. Personalized is this generative AI bot or whatever is customized for you and creates specifically for you. Imagine everything is a market of one where if you're scrolling on Instagram or TikTok, all of the content is created by generative AI specifically just for you. And then the last one is proactive, where every need is met or fulfilled before it's even felt by the human being. And so these three are really important because it's a way for us to structure what generative AI can do. Especially by what's missing. There's no predictive way for generative AI. Like if you're using generative AI to predict the weather, for example, or to predict, how hot it's going to be tomorrow, like the weather, or predict certain like baseball scores or something like that, that's bad. Generative AI can't do that. That's what traditional ML is for. Generative AI is really good at just these three applications. And there's a bunch of enabling technology that goes underneath this, which is tech, image, audio, video, which we'll talk about later. But the takeaway here is that mainly tech, image, and audio are all commercially viable today. Video is the only one that's not commercially viable. That one will take a little bit, like probably a year or two left. Okay, that brings us to our first paradigm shift. And actually, as I pull this up, let me make sure I have something else on here. Ooh, sorry. Oh God, sorry, my Zoom's messing up here a bit. Okay, that's fine, whatever. It used to be that you needed a lot of data and infrastructure and map models data infrastructure and algorithms to build your own model. If you were a TikTok or Facebook, you sort of hoarded a lot of data and you kept your algorithm on how you did your news feed and stuff like this very carefully. Now you get fully functional models out of the box, and nobody really understands the big shift that this happens. This is the equivalent of Facebook saying, if you send us your content, we'll rank it for you and we'll send it back. In fact, we'll just show you our ranking algorithm. Facebook would never do that because it's so proprietary. But that's what these AI companies are doing nowadays. And so there's two ways to access these functional models out of the box. One is you can call a model creator where you can ping a model and get a response. And there's companies like OpenAI and Anthropic that do this. And the other one is hosting your own model, taking a cutting edge model and hosting it, like Meta's open source models and things like this. Either approach you take, these resources are democratized like never before. These costs are dropping, these capabilities are going up, and nobody sort of really comprehends the vast opportunity that's available here. And we'll talk about where the opportunity is, but not enough people are reacting to it, which is kind of unfortunate. Even though there's a lot of hype, and we'll explain in a second why there's a lot of hype, and where the real money is. But first, let's talk about three types of companies, and we'll break apart where the money is between these three companies. First one is what we call a taker. They're just consume models. They take the model and they just slap it onto their website. Like Expedia used to do that, actually. Now they moved to be a fine tuner where you take the model, you customize it with your own data, and then you give it to customers. This is the best long-term place to be. And then finally, we have the model creators, which everybody knows, like OpenAI and all these folks, like Google, who make these models. This is we'll talk about why people get these wrong all the time, but number one, this is the best place to start. This is the best long-term place to be, and you basically don't want to be in this space, in this model creator space. And to understand why, let's talk about what makes up the generative AI industry. At the bottom is compute hardware. These are companies like NVIDIA, Intel, mostly just NVIDIA at this stage. Cloud platforms like AWS and Azure that buy these GPUs and serve them to customers. And then on top of that, you have people who make the models and people who take the models, and then people who make open source models and folks who customize them. And then there's users at the top. Here's a quick question for you. You can post your answers in the chat. If I was to give you $100,000, you could invest it in Mistral, which is a company that makes models, or Thomson Reuters Westlaw, which is a company that has a lot of data about all of the legal cases basically in the world. It's the world's largest legal database in English. If you had $100,000, which one would you invest in? If you can post in the chat, post in the chat, or you could just say the answer out loud in your head. The answer is you should buy Thomson Reuters Westlaw. And it's because we're going to talk about it in a second about the myth and reality of why. So the myth is that model creators will make all the money. People think about, like OpenAI is going to make so much money. They're raising at $100 billion. They're making all this intelligence, all these things. The reality is that models are becoming commoditized. It's actually very expensive to make these models and very expensive to serve them. And there's a ton of competition in this space. OpenAI and DeepMind and Meta and Anthropic and all these folks are making very similar models pretty much months after another. And that means, like how apples are commoditized, models will quickly become commoditized and are already becoming commoditized. And so because of this, what we see is there's a lot of opportunity to build on top of these models. So Sam Altman, who's the CEO of OpenAI, says, in my little group chat, there's this betting pool about the first year there's a one-person billion-dollar company. And that's because these models are so cheap and so commoditized that it's really easy and cheap to serve them and use them. But let's talk about how lucrative each layer is. The compute hardware layer, very lucrative. Probably in terms of who's going to make the most money with generative AI, it's going to be in the compute hardware space, mostly NVIDIA. But it's super defensible. If you guys have questions about why that's super defensible, I'm happy to answer those. Cloud platforms, it's mostly going to follow a very similar dynamic to just the current cloud dynamic, where they will be very lucrative, but they're taking cents off the dollar off each transaction. So they're a volume play. But in the application layer, it's anywhere from low to high, and it's seeming increasingly like it's a very high level of profitability and lucrativeness to make apps on top of these models. And it's because it used to be that the biggest advantages to succeed in technology were talent, infrastructure, and models. Now, the biggest advantages are distribution. So if you're an app builder, having an access to a large number of users, a really amazing user experience, and data. And so these moats have basically been exactly flipped from what they used to be with generative AI. It used to be that algorithm and raising a lot of money and having a lot of data centers and talent was really helpful. But now they're on the bottom. Now they're super weak. Now what matters is having a large sales team, having an amazing user experience, and potentially even having some data. Here's some quick data for you as to, just to nail this point of user experience and data matters way more. Where we did the research from our course highlights a very simple study where a set of users are presented with a really good user experience with a shitty model, with some like a worse model. So it's worse results. That's option A, really good UX. Option B is really good results, but a really bad user experience. And the vast majority of users pick the better user experience, even if it's a worse model or a worse set of results, which is quite shocking, and you wouldn't really expect that to happen. And then, but then you think about some broader trends and some broader numbers, and it starts to make a lot more sense. ChatGPT has been used by more than 1 billion people. I think it's maybe 1.5 or even 2 billion people at this point, a very large number of people. But they only have around 100 million or 200 million monthly active users. That means like 90% of the people that use ChatGPT, even though the results were amazing, never went back because they don't like the user experience of a chatbot. They like having it integrated, or they don't want to learn how to prompt engineer these things. And so user experience is super undervalued by most people, and research shows that it's actually the most valuable in generative AI, especially because trust matters so much, and building a really nice user experience builds a lot of trust. Which means another paradigm shift is, it used to be, again, to succeed in big tech, you used to need a lot of money, the best models, thousands of employees. Now what we're seeing is the companies that are taking the most advantage of generative AI and making a ton of money, like a mouth-watering amount of money, are just folks who have really good user experience and some sort of unique data set or some sort of unique distribution angle, and even up to 10 employees, and they make a lot of money. And so that means that the key AI winners used to be big tech companies. Now the key Gen AI winners can actually be non-tech companies that really focus on user experience and really focus on nailing a distribution channel. And so the best place to be right now is a mid-tier to large company, non-technical company that has troves of user data that they can use to fine-tune their model and an existing large user base. All these folks need to do is they just need to execute on it. Unfortunately, almost nobody's doing it correctly, and we'll talk about why. Any questions so far?
Hey, Aditya, can you say just a little bit more about what distribution exactly is? I know it has to do with number of users, but what do we mean by distribution?
That's a great question. So that's different from B2B, B2B, and B2C. In B2B, what we mean by distribution is a large sales network and a large number of existing business customers that you can sell push your AI models and features to, because they already have a lot of trust with you. In B2C, what we're seeing is a way to reach a large number of users especially in a niche market, really quickly and effectively. Let me explain what that means. It's even if with a generic model. Let me explain what that means. There's a company that you know, they actually recently changed their name because people found out what they were doing, and I forget what their new name is, but they used to be called Playa Vista Labs, and they made a chatbot that allowed you to talk to an AI girlfriend. And they did a really good job of marketing that to sort of lonely men, especially upper, older lonely men. But then there was a large backlash from the Christian community where, they said, talking to these bots doesn't make any sense. We should talk to Jesus and find a church community. And said, this same lab, this same company turned around and while continuing to make the other product, now makes a product called Bible Chat that allows you to talk with your Bible as if and converse like you're talking to like a pastor or something. It's the same company that makes both apps, but they did a really good job of marketing that AI girlfriend app to only lonely older men, and they did a really good job of marketing that Bible Chat to the Christian community, and they make millions off each app. So what we're increasingly finding with this B2C space is really effective marketing, especially on social media, to really specific niches. Does that make sense, Ruben?
Perfect.
Isn't that a crazy example? Isn't that insane? It's the same company that makes both. It's crazy. Okay, cool. So one of the paradigm shifts that a lot of people sort of forget or ignore is it used to be that software costs don't increase with usage. Now what happens is GenAI costs do. So the more your users use your product, the more cost you incur. And this fundamentally breaks how software and associated business models works today. And let me explain why. This used to be how software businesses used to work. It would cost you this much to basically build software, okay? And that would never change. That usage would, as usage goes up, the total software cost would never change for you to build it or for people to use it. But the total subscription price would stay high above. And so basically this whole area used to just be billions in profit. That's how like Salesforce gets so big, Microsoft gets so big, because this is just pure profit, which is amazing. Now, as usage goes up and you have a subscription price like a SaaS business, as GenAI cost goes up, as usage goes up, GenAI cost goes up because there's a cost per API call. And so pretty quickly, these businesses start to become unprofitable, which is pretty interesting. And actually, when we actually look at real company data, this chart ends up looking like this because a portion of the users are very active users. And so this GenAI cost becomes actually exponentially increasing. And so what we're seeing is that these software models are breaking with generative AI. And so if you go about launching a SaaS business with GenAI, or if you're running a SaaS business, or if you're thinking about launching a GenAI product, know that the typical business doesn't work anymore. The typical SaaS business, like, we'll pay you $10 a seat or just pay us $10 a month or something. What's happening now is people are launching new types of business models. They're saying seat plus, which is you pay us $10 for a seat, and then you pay us if you use the product more than we budgeted for. So what they're doing is they're saying total subscription price, and as this starts to go up, we'll also start to increase it. So we're seeing that a lot. Okay, any questions on business model? Okay. Now let's talk about some tips. And most common mistakes that we see companies make when they're building with generative AI. So one of the most common mistakes we see is companies often say, hey, we need to do something with generative AI in this space, and so we need to sort of launch something new, etc. And whenever companies start with that attitude, it never works. What you always want to start with and continue to start with is just user pain points and solving the most burning need with or without cool tech. So it doesn't matter if you use GenAI or not. And so instead of asking something like, can we use GenAI to do this? Start exploring something like, how might we solve this, like this major user problem, and then can GenAI solve this in a unique way? And that's a major, just this shift, just asking executives to make this shift, especially, is probably the biggest sort of indicator of success for generative AI product. Here's a great question. Here's a great sort of example. CarMax sells cars. And they went down and they did a bunch of user research as to how their users interact with their products and the things that they struggle with. And a key pain point on this user journey was that it was really hard for users to read all the reviews of every single car. And all they did is they put in a summary to explain what the reviews were and summarize what the reviews were. And it was extremely successful. It solved a user pain point. User satisfaction went significantly up with CarMax. And I'm not actually sure if they sold more cars or not, but we definitely know that it solved the user satisfaction of buying a car. Cool. The other mistake we often see companies make is starting with an internal problem, especially with an internal problem with no path towards a learning loop, as in an internal problem that they can't even expose externally. What is recommended is to start a user problem. And if you want, you can start with a user problem and test that product internally. And that is often much more successful. And you'll be surprised at how prevalent building an internal tool is, or building a chatbot. So this is a survey of leading companies, and especially reading through their financial statements and disclosures of their activities with generative AI. So only 20% of America's leading companies, didn't mention anything about generative AI. 30% did, but had no product. 50% said they implemented something in generative AI. Of those, 60% did a chatbot or something internal. 35% did something internal only, and only 5% and basically said they did generative AI but didn't do generative AI at all. And so internal tools are extremely popular. But when we actually ask users how useful is your internal tool from a survey of general employees, 99% of users find it, or 95% of users find it somewhat or not useful. And why do internal tools have such bad satisfaction? Is, while internal tools do have value, the problem is because companies think it's a helpful starting step, they don't put enough resources in it, and they don't iterate enough, and it's hard to measure results, which is a double sort of dagger, because the whole point of building generative AI and building internal tools is to learn how to test and iterate. But because internal tools don't get enough resources, they don't actually end up testing and iterating, and so they end up failing in many ways. And it's because companies are really afraid of launching a generative AI product publicly, because there's potential issues with hallucination, there's public relationship issues with deploying generative AI, especially in healthcare and financial services. But we often coach executives that these fears are significantly overblown. If you follow these few steps, we've never seen an incident. If you keep to beta or private preview, you avoid a chatbot or any free-form interactions, and you do an in-product content summarizations feature, which we'll talk about in a few slides, and you test rigorously. If you follow those 4 steps, there's not been a single incident yet. Okay, any questions so far again?
Hey, Aditya, what about the proposition that internal tools are not widely useful because they simply are internal, and there's not a good match with the external world?
No, exactly. No, literally, no, for sure. And the problem we see with companies building internal tools is that what they often build is they want to build something that's useful for everybody, for all of their employees or for most of their employees. And what ends up happening is they solve a very little pain point across a large number of people. And so they never use that product. If you're ever going to build an internal tool and you want to keep it internal forever, even, you'd rather pick anywhere from 20 to 100 people, like very small number of people, and build a really deep internal tool for them. And then they'll use it a lot, in which case you'll also learn how to build a generative AI product that's really useful, and you'll also build something that's actually useful for your employees. But yeah, I very much agree, Jordan. So actually, even though this is a Gen AI workshop, one of the most common mistakes we see people make is, like we just talked about, is picking generative AI explicitly. What's actually recommended is to pick the right cool tech for the problem. Let me give you an example. Walmart, and unfortunately you can't see with this Zoom screen here, is Walmart did a really good job with generative AI integrations because they didn't do anything around they did do some chatbot stuff, but one of their most successful integrations is allowing you to search in the search bar something like, oh, a Super Bowl party. And when you search on the search bar Super Bowl party, GenAI comes up with a list of recipes, a list of things that you need, and then provides this list like a Doritos packet and all these things. And then you can go in and automatically add those to your cart. So this way, it's not like generative AI is in your face or it's, they're explicitly using generative AI. They're just actually using generative AI in the background to provide you with what you need, which is exactly what we recommend a lot of clients to do. So just to summarize in terms of prioritizing GenAI opportunities and tips, start with user pain points, ask users about those pain points, solve user problems, and pick the right cool tech, which is generative AI. I know that seems really generic in general, but it's important to nail these things again, especially with those examples, because we see it happen so often. It's the biggest mistake we see companies make. Okay. And by the way, you can also post in the chat if you have other questions unrelated to what I'm talking about, because I'm happy to answer anything else. I not only teach the business side, but I also teach the math and technical sides as well. So I'm happy to explain any of that, considering we're at the halfway mark. Cool. The first thing that we would recommend not doing, now that we're talking about picking generative AI solutions, before we talk about picking generative AI opportunities, is prioritizing content creation. What is recommended to do is prioritize content consumption. Let me explain what that means. Content creation is something that goes request, response, request, response. And we call it naive product or first wave. This is like, hey, can you write an essay for me? Sure, here's the essay. No, this isn't very good. Could you add these things? Okay, here's the reply. Users generally really don't like this flow. The churn rate on these is really high. What is much more valuable and users value a lot more is taking a lot of information and summarizing it to get the concise insights from a lot of that information. Let me walk through this in a little bit more detail. Usually, content creation comes as a chatbot or natural language, and next-gen or content consumption is put into existing workflows. And we'll talk about some examples of what this means in a second, but really quickly, this is like, hey, help me write an email versus summarize my inbox or prioritize my inbox, or summarize this email for me. The user benefit of natural language in terms of content creation is often novelty versus content consumption is efficiency. And the tech often is fine-tuned models for content consumption because it gives much better results. Let's talk about some examples. Let's talk about some examples of what this is. Instead of creating a legal document for a set of lawyers, for example, you should analyze historical outcomes to advise on the best legal strategy that these lawyers should take. And instead of creating a bunch of tailored proposal documents for potential sales clients, you should go out and use AI to search the internet for what these salespeople are talking, what your customers are talking about, and how the market's changed. Instead of generating product specs, aggregate user feedback from multiple channels, from what your customers are saying, from Twitter, all these things, and use GenAI to summarize that. Instead of you building some sort of customer service bot that just talks to customers back and forth, monitor channels for customer sentiment. And there's other various examples, but let me show you some data on how useful content consumption is versus content creation. When we went and asked a bunch of users how useful is content consumption on a scale of 1 to 3, often they said 3 to 4. Like, hey, summarize this email for me, summarize this meeting, all this stuff. Summarize a set of documents. When we asked how useful content creation was, it was a 1 or 2 out of 4. So it's half as useful. Yet, this is the shocking part. Most companies continue to build content creation workflows. And research continuously shows day in and day out that they're not as useful. Generally users like content consumption significantly more. Here's a great example of a set of companies that have really taken it a good amount of advantage over this. these companies listen in on sales calls, summarize what happened in the meeting, and then give you advice on how you can improve your sales pitches. So they'll say, hey, you talked for, let's say, 40% of the meeting, but their best salespeople talk for only 20% of the meeting, and they let the customer talk for 80%. You ended the meeting and you didn't ask the three biggest questions that our best salespeople ask. Like, did you acknowledge the chat? Did you offer assurances? And did you set expectations? You didn't do that. Our best salespeople spend a lot of time understanding the business, and you didn't do a good job of that. You should do a better job of that. And so these companies make a ton of money. The content creation workflow of this is, hey, can I use my salesperson? Can I get this AI to send a bunch of emails out for me to a bunch of my sales prospects? But people don't like that. These emails aren't good. They become quite generic. It's not as good. They really like this. Salespeople pay through the nose for this information. Okay, cool. We won't talk about augmentation. What I want to talk about is building a chatbot. We have a question. Oh, Jordan, we have a question. This is so exciting. Dave Anderson asks, do you foresee this GenAI cycle and concepts for AGI? I'm actually not sure what that question means, Dave, but I will guess. If you want to elaborate and add more comments, feel free, but I will guess at what that question means. I'm so excited. We finally got a question. This is great. This is what I'm here for. So I assume you mean, do I foresee the same GenAI cycle that we saw with the internet? And it's almost for sure the case. So if we think about how the costs are dropping. Oh, I see. Okay. What's the difference? So let me first explain to everybody, what GenAI is versus artificial general intelligence. So artificial general intelligence, I think most people are familiar with, is essentially the official term is a level of intelligence that is indistinguishable from a human being. And why do we use that for a specific phrase is because it's not that is as intelligent as a human being or as feeling as a human being or something like this. It's that the results that come out from these models, voice, audio, all these things, is indistinguishable from a human being. And so that's what artificial general intelligence means, and including its reasoning capabilities. And so GenAI is a path towards artificial intelligence. So generative AI is actually, as I said earlier, a marketing term. What it covers, and it really exploded with ChatGPT, but what it covers is a set of models that generate new information. And so people call them generative AI. But it's increasingly likely that the models that got us here won't actually get us to artificial general intelligence. Won't, just because we got to this level of intelligence with large language models, it doesn't actually seem that large language models will continue to help us get to artificial general intelligence. We'll probably actually need a newer set of models, things like higher versions of autoencoders and things like this to get us to artificial general intelligence. And so GenAI is just the first phase of our path to get there. Does that make sense, Steve? I'm happy to answer that. Any follow-up questions on that or any other questions that anybody else has? Okay, cool. So let me explain really quickly about chatbots. So chatbots are everywhere. I think especially when GenAI came out with ChatGPT, people thought chatbots would be really popular. And so everybody builds chatbots. And to this day, people still build a lot of chatbots. We don't recommend building chatbots. What's recommended instead is to put GenAI features natively into your own product. And I'll explain this myth that people believe chatbots are super popular, and let's debunk them. How willing are you to use a chatbot? We asked a bunch of users, 100 users. 99% of users said they were not willing to use a chatbot. Okay. 99% of users said that even if it's a GenAI chatbot, they don't want to use it. And let me explain this really quickly. I assume the people joining this conversation are at least somewhat tech forward. And so, or at least somewhat tech forward. So you'll say like, oh, I love using ChatGPT, or I really like using a chatbot. But us as somewhat tech forward people aren't the average population. What we have to again realize is, let's say 1.5 or 2 billion people have used ChatGPT, and it only has 100 million or 200 million monthly active users. So the vast majority of people don't want to do this prompt engineering work and have to go through all this work. And so when you ask them, even if they did interact with a chatbot, how willing are they? How helpful was that chatbot? 80 to 95% find it not useful to only somewhat useful. So here's another thought experiment. What if, okay, actually, 1 second. Let me jump ahead and we can go back to those slides. Just because I want to make sure we nail this because I talked about it earlier. When we take that same feature that we talked about with those users for the chatbot, and we instead put that same feature natively into a product, right? So instead of an example of this is instead of having it saying go to a chatbot, hey, can you summarize my emails? Or hey, can you write this email? Instead just have a button that says summarize this email for me, or write a new email or something. Generally, summarize is what we used. 90% were somewhat or mostly willing to use the product, use the feature. And remember, this is the same exact feature. Nothing's different. And when they actually went out and used the feature, almost 70% find it somewhat to very useful. This is the same exact feature. We just took it from a chatbot and put it into the actual native product instead. And it significantly increased user satisfaction and user sort of engagement in general. So that's sort of the first sort of myth to break there. Any questions on that, or why it's still so popular? And we'll talk about really quick about why chatbots are so popular, especially if you're in a company. What we often get is, oh, chatbots are like so easy to start with. We can buy a chatbot off the shelf, etc. Why don't we start with that? Number one, let me say chatbots are helpful. They do work. We've seen companies, make a lot of money and save a lot of money with them. However, it's really difficult to get them right. They're ironically the hardest GenAI user experience to get right because you need to have no bias, you need to have correct answers, no hallucination, etc. But they're the easiest to start with. So they're the easiest to say, oh, I've done something in generative AI, which is why everybody does them. But then once you actually start putting them in front of customers, they are super difficult to actually get any value out of. Let me talk about a customer that has done really well, a company that has done really well called Klarna, where they have an AI assistant, and Klarna is like a payment platform, you can say. And so what they partnered with OpenAI very carefully, fine-tuned a model, did all these things. And you can answer questions like, hey, can you help me make sense of this refund or something? For them, they saved $40 million in 2024 so far because they solved the work of 700 full-time agents. So it's incredibly valuable, but it's really hard to get right. And so if you're an executive or a product leader or somebody in your company trying to do Gen AI, and you're going to say, hey, I would think we should start with a chatbot, don't. Because it's the most common mistake that we see companies make. Okay, it's actually also not recommended to go after a big, ambitious use case. What we often see is companies saying, oh, like, how do we differentiate ourselves from ChatGPT? How do we say, let's say you run some sort of like law company or legal company, or you run a law software company. You say, hey, what's happening now is I want to make a legal chatbot that helps answers lawyer questions or helps lawyers do their work or something. That is too ambitious of a use case. You should start off extremely small, extremely simple. So we actually recommend to start off with a really small incremental feature, because the research shows that these small incremental features for users, when you pair them with generative AI, are actually super valuable. So, we'll talk about a quick example, or we'll talk about an example in a couple of slides, but we'll talk about this example, let's say, about lawyers, where you can build this fancy legal chatbot, or you can just summarize a document. You can click summarize, the summarize button, or you can click, hey, find relevant cases for me, or something like this related to this document or related to this case, which the lawyer would have gone to ChatGPT to do if they knew about ChatGPT or were familiar with ChatGPT. But what we find is, if you take that process that customer went to ChatGPT for, or that user went to ChatGPT for, and put it natively into the product, number one, the folks who would have gone to ChatGPT use it in the product instead, find it a lot of value. And number two, what we find a lot of is a lot of customers or users didn't actually know they could use ChatGPT for that flow and use that product a lot, use that feature a lot. Okay. And the reason why leaders, and we find product people in general go for really ambitious use cases, is that I think they worry about the wrong things. They'll say, hey, user trust will be gone if we provide something super simple, and users won't try it again. And it's a lot of work to implement these generative AI features, and it won't provide enough value. This experience needs to wow to differentiate from ChatGPT. We hear that a lot. But the problem with this ambitious use case is, because they think, oh, I need to do all of this work, it prevents people from not launching and iterating. These fears are significantly overblown. So you'd rather build iteratively with users. Okay. I can talk through some more data and about how to do MVP and chatbots and things like this. But any questions, anything else you folks want me to cover in the last 10 minutes?
So I had a question about, well, the last big wave was essentially social media or cloud computing, but let's just say it was social media. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the interrelationship between Gen AI and social media, how they're going to interact with each other, or any predictions?
Great question, Jordan. So, what's really interesting is social media also had its waves in some sense. So, social media started off initially as a way to connect people. Now, it seems mostly like a way for people to consume content, like Instagram Reels, TikTok, all these things, etc. And so, how I think generative AI is affecting this, in fact, it's already is affecting it, is using generative AI to make custom content for people. And so let me give you a great example. So first of all, I would say at this point, 20% of the content I consume, I can identify as being made with generative AI. Here's a very common example. On Instagram and TikTok and all these things, we see, you can see a bunch of these explainer videos, which say like, how do trees grow? Or like, how far is the moon? Or how big is the sun? And all these things. And they use stock images, and then there's a voice that explains over them. That's for sure made with generative AI. Another one that's super common is movie clips. Like you can see on Instagram and TikTok, you'll see like movie clips or TV clips or all these things. And that's because generative AI watches the show, looks at one of the most dramatic parts of the show, clips it, adds captions, and then posts it automatically to YouTube or to Instagram or TikTok, all these places. So number one, content consumption, I think, is going to change significantly with generative AI. And also, people are doing human-generated avatars or AI-generated avatars instead of actual human beings talking. So that's number one. In terms of generated content, I think the vast majority of it is going to be generated by generative AI. Number two, in terms of actually connecting people, I think what's really interesting about this is I actually doubt generative AI will have a large impact on connecting people. I think what will have a bigger impact is other technologies like VR and AR and all these things. But generative AI, I think to really connect people well, you would potentially have to have like a bot of like a replica of a person or something like this that can communicate with others. And they just don't seem to do very well. That was a long-winded explanation. Does that any follow-ups on that? Jordan? No, I'll go. Okay,
Good.
cool.
I love it. Thank you.
Anybody else? Or I can just continue to talk about my lecture. I have about 80 more slides, but because I wanted to make sure that we covered any other questions as well. But I want to make sure, I'm here to answer questions, and I'm here to make sure that, it's not just one way. So you can ask me about, especially in the last 10 minutes, you can ask me about the technology behind generative AI. I also teach that. You can ask me about the market dynamics. I teach that in the other course. This course is most about building, so I talk about building and myths associated with it. Any other questions associated with any of those? Okay, looks like none, so I will continue chatting. So, one of the most common mistakes we see a lot of people make is they build a generative AI feature and then they ask customers, do you like using this feature? And most customers say yes, because most users say yes because they're really polite. Instead, even if you build a generative AI feature, you should still go back to the cutting board and drawing board and say, ask questions like, what is your most burning pain point? Or how might summarization or automation or augmentation help your workflow? And those we find significantly increase the chance that you ask the right user questions. I won't go talk through the right user questions too much because I just want to summarize a few tips really quickly. Content consumption is better than content creation. Integrated feature is better than a chatbot. And integrated means putting a chatbot, a GenAI feature natively into your product. A small use case done well, research shows provides more value than a big use case because big use cases are really hard to get right. They take longer to release, all these things. And remember to ask the right user questions. In this last, actually, there's an additional question. Dave Anderson asks an additional question. What are your thoughts on the normalization of data backends so GenAI tools can access them for analysis? Is it just a matter of everything is accessible via API now? Is there standard API that will win out? So what Dave is asking is, generative AI works really well as a reasoning engine. So if you train it with a lot of data or you put a lot of data into it, then it's really good at churning out the right answer, right? Like if you're training a lawyer or a doctor, it's really good at reasoning. But you have to provide it with all of the right data so that it makes the right decision. And you have to also train it with the right medical textbooks and things like this. Or legal textbooks if you're a lawyer, or legal cases. And so what Dave is asking is there a standard way for all of this data to be put into generative AI? And the current answer is no. And I expect that there won't be a standardization here because companies don't have an incentive to build a centralized way to do this. So let me give you an example. So obviously the OpenAI and all these model makers will try to make a standardized way for people to ingest data and for people to train it. But companies don't have an incentive to make it easier for these model makers to take their data. If anything, companies are trying to keep their data really secure, even if they're training their own fine-tuned model. What I find is companies are very paranoid. They say, this is our data. We want to, even if we were going to put it in our open source model and we're going to train it ourselves and we're going to do all these things very secretively. But oftentimes, they're often very sort of paranoid about this stuff. And so there's no, even if there was a standardized way to train these models and use a standard API, I doubt that these companies would adopt it. Because even today, they took the most complicated route to train their own models because they don't want to use any external infrastructure. Because they're just so paranoid. And often it's really difficult to adopt external infrastructure in general. Like if you're like a JP Morgan or something like this and you have a lot of internal banking infrastructure already. Okay, cool. I was gonna play a quick game, but we have 3 minutes left. So I don't know if we have time to play the quick game. What instead I could do is I am going to, unless we get more questions, I'll quickly leave my sort of parting thoughts on what you can do to learn more about generative AI. And how can you get more involved in this space if you're interested in this so far. Number one, what we tell everybody to do is to use ChatGPT or these LLMs for almost everything you do in your life. And that is probably the best way for you to figure out what the GenAI limitations are and where it's useful in your life, or where it's useful in most people's lives. Let me explain a really quick example. A banker that we worked with, or a bank that we worked with, had their bankers use like a company sanctioned large language model. And one of the bankers submitted some information about a customer requesting a loan to the large language model. And the large language model provided a really good answer for why the customer didn't deserve the loan. And the banker communicated that reasoning to the customer, including, it seemed like, using a lot of the actual copy. And this banker started using this workflow so much that they shared it with their manager, who shared it with their regional manager, and things like this. And this person now runs an initiative to scale this sort of LLM reviewing loan methodology across the company. Obviously, that's a very unique use case. But what we find is when we ask users, when we ask people to just use ChatGPT for everything, they learn more than if they went out and attended a lot of these webinars or attended a lot of these things about what GenAI could do and everything, or like where GenAI will be. Because they'll quickly understand that GenAI isn't good at most things. So that's number one. Just use, and if you think you use ChatGPT a lot for everything you do, I promise you're not using it enough. There's people who out there who have ChatGPT open all the time, every time they work, or anytime they have a question, or anytime they do anything, they ask ChatGPT first. Number two, if you are interested in generative AI in general, it's super useful to follow certain people on LinkedIn or Twitter, because most of media doesn't cover, I think, the major points and major developments. And if you want to keep up to date on the major developments, there's a few people, and you can just search online, like biggest GenAI influencers, and follow them. And I can potentially send a list later as well. But that's it. Those are the two parting thoughts on how I would really get much more involved in generative AI. Cool. That's it.
Okay, any final questions for Aditya? Okay. Well, we want to thank Aditya for being with us. It was a phenomenal presentation, very informative. I think everybody's got a leg up now, and we look forward to seeing you again. The next event will probably be within 2 to 3 months. Topic to be decided, and we hope to see you all there. Invite your friends. Thanks again, Aditya, and I'll be in touch with you personally. But if anybody wants to reach you, Aditya, can they email you, or how do we
Add me on LinkedIn, yeah, and then send me a message. I unfortunately do get a lot of LinkedIn reach out, so I may miss it. So just follow up if anything. Cool.
Okay, great. Thanks everybody. Have a great night. See you later.